finished the last episode invoking fire, and with reason, for there are some serious trailblazers that for all their power, we have left them to oblivion. Today, we will step out to the fringes and bring some of these brave artists closer to the center, where they belong. In part 1 and 2 of my series on art and feminism, we explored what is art, what is the canon, why the canon is a tool of exclusion, and how different groups have slowly managed to finally be seen. In this final episode, I present you the last piece of the puzzle. A cautionary warning: today's trip involves will, memory, and naturally, coffee. Quasi-feministas, today, see me, remember me. Thank you, Fanny, so much for joining us for this final episode of this series in art and feminism.
My pleasure.
I started to realize that it seems like artists are at the limit of the human experience. They're almost like the forecasters of where the zeitgeist is going, willing to take a step forward to see what is out there. And I know that you have prepared a few pieces to try to discuss all of these issues more deeply.
Yeah, because we've talked at length about the different waves and indeed the canon and the ideas behind contemporary production, mainly of women artists.
This is Fanny Curtat, art historian extraordinaire. You know her, we love her, and when you hear this sound, it's time to take a look at the artworks that she put together in a single link below. Now, back to the podcast.
And as we've mentioned before, there are some women artists. It's just that we can't seem to remember them. Even though some of them were massively famous in their days and super wealthy, they were treated in their own times and in ours as tokens and as curiosities and exception. There's this weird balance that, as you were mentioning, artists are trailblazers. They're at the edge of what's being made, ideas, they're dealing with the representation of the world. I mean, representation is key. And so you have these women who had to find a way to be trailblazers, but to be recognized by an institution. And so how did they find this balance between cutting edge and between still conforming to a canon that they were, of course, excluded from?
It is almost an impossible task, because they had to excel, they had to be extraordinary, but they were never given the tools to be extraordinary. So the ones that actually got noted, they were well beyond extraordinary. This makes me think about politics, because in order to achieve power, women conform to the form of leadership and power that was imposed basically by men. And that was dangerous, because then if you appear to be too masculine, that is not the way to go. That's not desirable. But if you're too feminine, you don't even get a chance. And then some women manage to do it. And then yet again, we tend to forget them. There's so many countries that have had, let's say, a president or a prime minister that is female, but not two, just one. Here's a partial list of countries that have had a single female leader in their history. Australia, Brazil, Bolivia, Canada, Costa Rica, Croatia, Ecuador, France, Germany, Latvia, Nicaragua, Pakistan, Panama, Poland, Turkey. Honestly, does anybody remember the names of these women?
We have the same token mentality in many different ways, not just for women. And Barack Obama, for some people, was a token because it was like, oh, okay, well, we can check that box. We had a Black president, and so we're good, we're cured.
The phenomena is called moral licensing, a cognitive bias that explains how when people behave in a moral way once, they are more likely to display behaviors that are immoral later, without so much guilt or threatening their self-image. You know, is the, hey, I voted for Barack Obama. Hey, that must mean I'm not a racist. Hey, if I'm not a racist, I can say all this nasty shit and not feel bad about it.
You know, in art history, the first thing that we learn about is Vasari's records of biographies of famous artists. And you can have access to this gallery in Florence where you have all of these portraits of male geniuses. And you have one woman in them. And it's the first one actually on the document. It's Properzia de Rossi. She is undeniably a curiosity. And he talks about her, recognizes her talent, but then doesn't give it entirely to her. He does not give her the same treatment he gives the other one, in the sense that we don't know how her talent came about her, which is a big deal when you try to establish the male genius. People want to know where it's from. And this one woman, we don't know where her knowledge came from. We don't know how she practiced. We don't have a lot of details about her, but he still recognizes her. That's a token. That's the curiosity. He talks about her because she's sort of an abnormality. Mm-hmm. And so as long as you keep this idea that, okay, we've got one, it's a thing, it's possible, but then you go back to whatever else you're doing, then we still have this token mentality and nothing's really changing because the system's not really changing. And you're right, art teaches us a lot about dynamics because it's connected to everything. It's connected to politics, it's connected to markets, it's connected to anthropology, religion. It's really at the core of everything. If we look at the document, we have the Grassi family coats of arms. What we're going to talk about is an object that's being sculpted. Sculpture, of all of the art form, is the most masculine one. And we are in Renaissance. We are in the 15th century. And so no chance a woman will ever get access to apprenticeship. As a woman, she did not have access to materials. And so necessity brought her to deal with what she had in this beautiful object. It's actually fruit stones. It's peaches and nectarine stones that she just carved with incredible talent. It's so precise. You need a looking glass to see all of the details of like the Virgin Mary opening her cape with all of these faces in it. We have our first case of I am going to find a solution. This world does not want me. I am going to make it no matter what. And she persevered, though we don't know why again or how, because Vasari chose not to tell us. But we do know that she fought her way through and ended up participating in this great contest in the decoration of a very famous church. Is it a church?
Basilica.
Yeah, a very important. Is it written underneath? I put it in the image and then forgot what I wrote. And so she ended up participating in a contest of sculpture, and then she won, and she did this beautiful piece. You have a work that does not pale in comparison to anything the men of the era could have done. She's ticking all of the right boxes. She's doing it as she is supposed to do it. Mm-hmm. But here we're getting to another catch-22. So she is recognized for her talent because she does it like the men do, but she does it a little too well. And she's not supposed to know the male form that much. And so her competition ended up resorting to the same strategy a lot of men will resort to when confronted with successful artist women, which is tarnish their reputation, because that was everything for them.
Are we still talking about the 15th century? Because that shit happens on the daily still.
And in the end, the attacks against her were so violent that she just gave up and died poor, destituted, and alone in her 30s. She's still the only female noted in Vasari. Vasari is really the cornerstone of art history. You have two important figures to remember. That's Vasari and Winkelmann. And he talks about one female, and that's her. I think he added a little bit more women as he went on, but she is still pretty phenomenal. Mm-hmm. She is the first one we know about. She is a sculptor. She's in Renaissance where women were not even strolling around on their own in the city, and then still ended up alone and destituted and forgotten.
I am so curious. I want to absolutely know how on earth did she manage to get the resources? Because sculpting is a very expensive thing to learn.
Well, the fruit stones are probably the answer to a lot of that, because through that she could showcase her talent. But it was a very much an uphill battle, and you have all of the same, I wouldn't say all of the same obstacles that we still see women having to go through, which is maintaining their reputation and still having to represent something that's feminine enough and not too masculine, but still applies and answers to all the masculine expectations.
Now I'm looking at the next painting, and you're getting me excited here because I see a chessboard. What's going on this side?
So Sofonisba Anchisola is one of the other few women that we know of in the Renaissance that we still remember. And unlike Propercia de Rossi, she's an example of a woman who made it all. And that's because she had the protection of the court. It's always the same path that allows women in history to access recognition. And either their father is an artist, or the father is supportive, or they have the protection of a man. Propercia de Rossi did not have that, did not end up really doing too well for her.
Can I just say, even today, the power of men over the future of women is overwhelming. Male support is necessary, but male opposition is devastating. If you are a guy and you don't know how to be an ally, start by giving credit where credit is due, especially if the person comes from a disfavored background. It really pains me to say it, but at this point your voice still has considerable impact. Think about it this way. If I'm walking with a girlfriend on the street and someone hassles her and I say, "Hey, stop it," they'll probably say, "Shut up, you're next." But if I'm walking with a friend, someone hassles her, and a guy steps in and say, "Hey, stop that," they will probably stop immediately.
But when you have the case of Sofonisba Anguissola, she was born in Italy. She was small nobility, but the family was rather poor. The dad made it his mission to make his daughters into accomplished ladies. And he saw great, great talent in Sofonisba Anguissola and had so much faith in her abilities that he sent a portrait that I think a little drawing that she did to Michelangelo, who recognized her talent. And so everybody was quite impressed with her. And she had access to a world that was otherwise very difficult for women to access. And so she started painting and developed great skills as a portrait maker and a type of art that we call conversation piece, which is the one that you see with the chessboard. It's her sisters playing chess, almost like women can have the pieces in their hands. And that's the time also in Renaissance where the chess piece of the queen became such an important piece, the piece that we know it is today.
Not so fun fact. When the final power moves of the queen were established, men started calling chess the mad woman's chess game, because the queen was hysterically aggressive, of course. Men and women played chess, at least in Europe, in equal numbers. It was even a form of courtship. It is believed that the shame attached to being too aggressive or too hysterical became too much, and this dissuaded women from ever playing. The game became associated with men, and women who ended up playing it became, curious exceptions again.
She's leading us to this idea that women can find their place through strategy. And she will, because she got access to the Spanish court of Philip II. What's the name of his wife? Philip II? Isabelle de Valois? Is it because I wrote it on the document again?
Yeah, I'm reading it right now.
I keep forgetting her.
Look, the listeners don't know this, but Fanny has been talking about these dates and these names, and she's just talking. I am looking at the document that she has created. She's actually talking out of memory. But yeah, Isabelle de Valois holding a portrait of Philip II. Yes,
exactly. And so this portrait shows that once she had access to the court, she became very, very successful, but she had to comply to the strict rule of the court. And as a woman, she did not have access to the title of official painter of the court. So she had to be a lady in waiting of the queen.
Yeah.
But still, she adapted and she did all of the right codes. Again, it was all about playing by the rules. It was not about defying the canon so much as showing that they were entirely capable of being part of it. And she managed to be incredibly famous, incredibly wealthy, but still we don't remember her. It's still not the great history painting. It's still not what Michelangelo would have done. It's still portraits. And she was able to make it, but because she had also this head start of her father, of course, her incredible talent, but then she had the ability to make herself a place in the world.
You're making me think of the importance of recognizing splendor or skill or talent or drive on someone else. And if you are in a position of being a patron, if there is a potential for helping out when these very special, extraordinary people cross your path, that might be the beginning of a change. That might be the beginning of a form of representation again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we know that we've ostracized a lot of people and groups from the norm, we could say the canon of society. And so all the more we need to be aware of how to help to just, again, push representation. And on that note, we might note also that all of these examples in the document, of course, are white women. And so that goes to show how important the second episode of the podcast was, that we need to be inspired by these women, but also apply it to our modern day context, which is about pushing the question of gender even more, pushing the questions of identities and communities even more, because it's all about finding your voice, helping somebody to find its voice, and trying to question the canon or trying to be part of it. And by trying to be part of it, being a trailblazer, because if you get to be part of it, then by definition, you expended it. So, and the last portrait I would mention of her is that you have a self-portrait with Bernardino Campi. As you can see, she represented her master painting her. And it might look like we have this example of a man deciding how a woman should look, but when you look closely, he's doing the detail work that an assistant would be doing in the studio. Like, he's doing this small detailing and she's the one looking straight at you, and she is in control of her representation. It's very subtle, but it's about finding ways of expressing your voice, you know? The next artist, Lavinia Fontana, which you have the self-portrait of her playing clavichord. She was about to get married, and she sent that to the man who was going to be her father-in-law. And in the back, you have this chest along the wall, and that's supposed to be her dowry. But she was poor. But you have in front of the window, straight in front, in the light, you have the easel. And so it was like a way of saying, I know where my riches are. I know this is where it is. And she is one of the few who lived to be a very wealthy artist and to have her own studio and to support her family through painting. And she had the support of the Gozzadini family. And the portrait that's just underneath is about these women. Lodomia is the one with the red dress. And then her sister is Ginevra, which is on the other side. And this portrait was commissioned by Lodomia. And it was about reclaiming her image. It's a weird family drama. It looks like it's just about putting forth their riches and the jewelries. But when you look deeper, there are all of these secret stories. Whereas Lodomia is way prettier than Ginevra. Already the first sort of insult through painting and the representation of the sister that is undeniably uglier than the one who commissioned the portrait. And you have the father in the middle who has his hand on his daughter Ginevra, because he had put up his two daughters in a weird competition where the one that would give him a male heir first would have access to all of his riches. The other one would have nothing.
How history would have changed if only they knew back then that to make a baby boy, you need a Y chromosome. And the only one that can provide a Y chromosome is the father, not the mother. Or if we valued girls same as boys, that would have also worked.
And so they became in this weird, very cruel pregnancy competition. And Lodomia lost. Ginevra won, and that's why the father has his hands on her. But Lodomia is petting a little dog, which is fidelity, to show that she was always, there for her family. And when you look closely at the details in the medallion, you have this figure, which, if you can make it out, is a male body with a sex that's super erect. And in the other one, the one that's Lodomia is wearing, you have a figure with a sex that is flaccid. And that's because Lodomia's husband blamed her for not having access to her father's riches, because he blamed her for not getting pregnant. And so through these representation of medallion, it's like she said, Ginevra had the male with the erect penis, and then I was stuck with you, my dude. And so it's not entirely on me. And so this is all about her and Lavinia getting hold of the narrative and taking control of their reputation and taking control of their image and having their own side of the story known for posterity.
That is fascinating.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's not about a revolution of the system. It's about finding ways to insert your voice in it.
I see the next one. That is Angelica Kaufman. If I recall correctly, one of the first 2 female artists from the Academy.
Exactly. And that's the irony, because we did mention her like that. She was very much a token for the Academy. Mary Moser too. At that point, Angelica Kaufman, super famous, super wealthy, was asked by the Academy to paint ceilings in the building. Like, she was something that was going to help bring them notoriety through her fame. But she's still a pretty great representation of, again, this catch-22 in which women were. Because you have the Academy was supposed to help its member by providing them education, studio, and then a chance to exhibit their work. But women did not have access to the male body. They could not be in the same presence of a nude body. And so they were stuck with needing to check the same boxes as men, but not being able to show that they know anything about male bodies, because that would not be proper.
Is that the reason why women ended up painting like beautiful flowers and beautiful fruit, but to showcase their skill without showing that they were a horse to the eyes of everybody else?
Yeah, that's called minor arts. And the Royal Academy, at some point, they were like, okay, we're going to grant access to what they called minor arts and what was considered amateur. At that point, amateur was not as bad as today, but it came in and they saw it as a threat and they ended up getting rid of it entirely. Then it became the pejorative notion that we know it is today. And so when Angelica Kaufman was confronted with this catch-22, she found 2 solutions. The first one was she represented statues in her painting. And so you had a naked statue in her painting. So it wasn't a male body because she had copied a statue. So that was an inanimate object. So she was okay. But it was still about representing male anatomy. Yeah. You need to be admirative of like the solutions that they found.
Yeah, you gotta give it to her. That was clever.
And the other solution that she had was to play this feminine card to her advantage, because she chose mythological subject, but she focused on the women and she focused on the emotional side. And there was a market for that. For all of the glory of historical subject and like battle scenes and very dramatic, very masculine poses, well, there was a market for families who wanted something else in their homes, and women who were still wealthy, very proper, but maybe wanted some other sides of myth and history. And so she focused, like we see the Sorrow of Telemachus, and you see a scene where it's all about the emotion. It's transmitting what was going on. The same with Hector taking leave of Andromache. It's not about representing Hector in action. It's about showing his watery eyes as he's saying goodbye to Andromache and this touching moment. But again, out of necessity. Just like Propercia de Rossi, who had to turn to fruit stones in order to practice sculpting, like it's never a question of talent. Mind you, when Mary Moser and Angelica Kaufman were part of the first, I think, 32 male members, it took, after they left, it took 100 years for the Academy to allow women back in. Again, you have the token mentality. The same that you were mentioning, that some countries had a female president or female prime ministers. And I just want to mention that Angelica Kaufman, just like Propercia de Rossi, they went at her for a reputation because she was very beautiful, very charming. And so she was accused of being too flirtatious, and that every man who paid for a portrait was in love with her, that it might have been somebody who painted the portraits for her because she was too beautiful, still a thing. Wanted to mention that.
Oh, for sakes.
Exactly. And it shows also that when we say that something is systemic, it's because it's not just about the title. It's not about them having access to a certain title, certain area, no matter what. It's about the condition of possibilities that allowed them to get there. For women to have a place as artists, they needed to have access to training, to material. In order to get to that last step, which is recognition, there are a lot of steps before that that are just considered systemic. They did not have a place in it. They did not have access to the tools.
Yep, there is a debt that we owe. Let me be clear, because this is not just about recognizing the past, it's about squaring it, about undoing the blocking of people's potential and rescuing all that humanity lost, because a whole chunk of the population was systematically blocked. Think about it. If your group is excluded from owning land, having a bank account, having education, having control over your reproductive cycle for centuries, I'm sorry, but food stamps and one president that looks like you is not enough to reverse the damage. And yes, I am talking about affirmative action, because affirmative action is not about university and office quotas. It's about everything that has to happen so you can actually make it there. There, I said it.
Marie Antoinette also is a good example of what you were mentioning about women helping each other out. When Marie Antoinette arrived in France, she had this reputation of being old-fashioned. She came from Austria. It was a different court than what was happening in France after Louis XV. She needed help. And Rose Bertin was a seamstress. And mind you, 100 years ago, seamstress and fashion, those were male things. And Rose Bertin, through her skills and her ambition, created her own store in Paris called Le Grand Mogul. And she got an interview with Marie Antoinette and convinced her she could help her revamp her image.
Marie Antoinette needed an extreme makeover. If only reality TV was a thing back in 17th century France. Hey, don't judge me. You know you watch it too.
And the image in your head that you have of Marie Antoinette full of frills and ribbons, and that's Rose Bertin.
Wow.
Like, she created the whole style around Marie Antoinette, especially like these poof hairstyles. Sometimes it was like 3 feet high with like a boat stuck into it, or like a bird stuck on the side. And women were exactly that, masterpieces walking. They were artworks. And she took Marie Antoinette out of the image and brought her to a fashion icon. And she was a commoner. And she had access to the queen. She would see her twice a week for like a year and a half. It was a big thing. So she is part of the image of Marie Antoinette. The other big part is Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, who was a famous portraiteur. She was also very, very beautiful. And she used her self-portrait as, look, this is how beautiful you could be. And also she painted herself with her daughter. And she was in a time where, you know, it was the Enlightenment. Of course, we're getting near to the revolution. We all know what happens to Marie Antoinette. So a lot of stuff is happening. And so she made it her calling card of this femininity, very almost erotic, but also still very motherly, where you have her with her child. She has these beautiful portraits of children, very soft, very feminine. And so she was called in to help Marie Antoinette, because at that point, everybody hated her. And so Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun became a favorite of the queen. One of the portraits that she did of her, Marie Antoinette as de Lorraine-Habsbourg, Queen of France, and her children, trying to save and salvage Marie Antoinette's reputation by showing that in the back, what you have on the right side is actually a jewelry box. And it's to show her real riches are her children, a way of showcasing, again, that she is corresponding with the zeitgeist of her time, which was motherhood, this sort of softness, and they were trying to soften her image. And it did not work out. And she, again, Marie Antoinette, really helped these women, granting them the possibilities of working their magic. And thanks to her, Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun got access to the Academy, which was accepting some women of exception. But revolution happened. When that happened, both of these women were associated with almost corrupting the queen, and at least profiting of her frivolous nature. When the French mob raided the Versailles Palace, they went straight for all of the Rose Bertin's dresses and tore them apart. And so even though these two women came from low levels of society, they were associated with this style of monarchy that was being thrown away. They both fled. And Rose Bertin lost everything because the style she had created was suddenly associated with anything the country, the Republic, had to get rid of. Mm-hmm. And Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun went through Italy, through Moscow. She created an incredible career for her days. She is now in the gallery of portraits that we mentioned in the Vasari gallery. Yeah. The irony is that the Ancien Régime, which was supposed to be the opposite of the freedom of the revolution, was actually granting a little bit more access to women than the Nouveau Régime. Because once that happened, women were barred entirely from the academy.
Like Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, a child prodigy, a polyglot, a poet, an erudite. She chose to join the Catholic Church as a nun, because in truth that gave her more intellectual freedom than a marriage in 17th century Mexico. Tokens of freedom can be found in the oddest places, which is to say, restrictions can happen where one doesn't expect them, which is to say, freedoms are not to be taken for granted.
You see Rose Bertin, and if you didn't have her, maybe we wouldn't have Dior, Chanel, Prada. Also, the way we see fashion now, meaning that Marie Antoinette changed dresses every season. Yeah. Much closer to the way we see fashion now than that what was happening before. Again, very awful for the context in which she was accused of spending too much money. But what I mean is that we expect Rose Bertin to be a trailblazer in that sense, but also to represent ideals that we want today. And it was not perfect. She was still catering to a system that needed to be questioned, and the ideals of revolution and enlightenment, we needed that. And so they're not perfect, but they're doing their thing, and they're ambitious, and they're helping each other out. And these women made it in a world that was not actually welcoming them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'll mention quickly, I wanted that, Corinne Larson. This is one of the examples I wanted to get to because she was not trying to be an artist. She did not have the ambition of Rose Bertin or Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun. She was in Sweden, trained to be an artist. Her family was very encouraging. She had access to training and everything. But she married an artist and stopped painting like a lot of women did back in the days. And then he focused on his career and she focused on her home. But at that time, we are in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. She's very close to what in England was happening as the arts and craft. In Paris, it was Art Nouveau. In Sweden, I think it was called National Romantic Movement. It was all about this revolution of arts and crafts. So we talked about minor arts being attributed to women. And she went full on with it. Arts and craft is all about questioning industrialization, the way we see life, and giving value to everything that's handmade. And so we have images of everything she did through weaving and through crochet and decoration of her home that made it a piece of art, that made it a style, that made it a lifestyle. And we have access through it because of her husband, who painted it and represented it. And it's years after that she got the recognition that she deserved, which was to have revolution interior design. And now she's very close to the Swedish identity. This doesn't shock us as being particularly revolutionary because we just see a bright, cheerful home filled with color, very homey, very comfortable, very bright, with handmade stuff and flowers, and it's rustic and everything. But that's not what interior design was at the time. It was dark, gloomy, very heavy, symmetrical. Nothing was mismatched. Everything was a set. And then she just exploded with it. The domestic became her field. And when you look at that pattern on the table runner, I mean, that pattern is edgy. That's not just boring representation of like a rustic feel. No, everything is edgy. It's about matching colors. It's about still being mindful of the family. She did not lose sight of the fact she was a mother, that her children were living there. And it was thought. She had knowledge of what was happening in that time. She went with it. It was a concept. She was doing her thing. And she did that way, way before we even thought it was just normal. Much later, she got the recognition that she deserved. And this idea of lifestyle as art inspired IKEA. Because now when you look at IKEA, for us, it's entirely normal to have like mismatched furniture, to have edgy curtains with patterns, with bright colors that don't necessarily match as a unit. That's her. She inspired that. And through the endeavor of changing domestic life and having this idea of lifestyle as art, she made her way. And in that sense, she was very much a trailblazer. It's pretty incredible in that sense. Okay, one last one.
Absolutely.
And then I'm done. Okay, Rosa Bonheur. Everybody needs to learn about Rosa Bonheur. She's a French artist, and she is from the 19th century. She was so famous, so widely known, made much more money than male artists at the time, and had global recognition. She went way past Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun. And her father called it, by the way. She had a very supportive father who, again, helped her, paint her. You can see a thread here, going back to the systemic discussion where they need a boost from somebody, otherwise the doors are closed. And her father really supported her and said that she would surpass Madame Vigée-Lebrun. And Rosa Bonheur loved animals. She loved animals. She wanted to paint animals. She did not want to have a married life. She did not want to stay stuck in the domestic. She wanted to paint animals. And she was incredibly good at it. The painting that really started everything for her was the horse fair. And you see it's filled with action, with movement. It's very dynamic. And that's not a womanly subject. She was like, no, I want to paint animals. I need to do it like that. I need to be in that milieu. But to be in it, she had to go to horse fairs. And she went regularly because she was committed. But she was a woman. She would get harassed all the time. Yeah. And so she went to the police and asked for a special permission to dress like a man. Permission de travestissement. And because of that, and because of her short hair and general appearance, she did look like a man, or at least not at all like a woman.
Yeah, and if you're in an environment where that's not even permitted, then if people are not expecting it, then you have that advantage.
They're not looking for it. And she was so famous that when she got to her 30s, she could buy a chateau. The chateau became a place for her to have tons of animals. Like she had a menagerie. She had even lions, which she painted. Like she was so strong and ambitious. She did not care at all what people think of her. Rosa Bonheur, through all of her success, was always dragged back to the question of her gender. Always mentioned that it was a woman. It was great, even for a woman, almost looked like a man could have done that. Gender was always a thing. She had 2 lifelong partners. The most important one was Nathalie Vicas. She was very clear about her sexual orientation. And it was very clear for her that it was private, nobody's business, and that she would just do her own thing. And so from getting the permission from the police to dress like a man to painting exactly what she wanted, it was not about conforming to anybody. It was about, no, that's what I want to do. I love animals. I want to paint that. Like, she had no qualms. She is so badass. And she is not as talked about as male artists of her time.
Absolutely. Full disclosure to the listeners, I prepare before an episode in front of Fanny because she's an expert on what she does. And even with that, I've never heard her name until you mentioned it. How is that possible?
Yeah.
We need to change that. We need to address the amnesia to those disenfranchised and ignored.
We're talking about women who were token, who were curiosities, but they made it and were wealthy, most of them. But they all had something that helped them along the way. They were still in the realm where it was very, very difficult, nearly impossible, but there was a sliver of hope. There's a whole category of people for which the access was just entirely barred. We don't have people of color in the list we've been talking about. We don't have representation of other countries. It's still very Eurocentric.
Can you think of a single female artist with a disability, for example?
In the past, you mean? Because in contemporary art, yes. But like in the past, No. I don't know all of them, grant you. It would be hard for me to say that it never happened, but I can say for sure that they would have had even more obstacles. In a way, that's where we need to focus on, and that's where we should end this discussion. It's about the fact that ultimately we've been talking a lot about men and women. The goal is for it not to be a thing and to be just talking about artists. That's where contemporary art takes us. That's where we need to go, and that's what we were talking about in the previous podcast, is we need to go further and just get away from this idea of the canon, get away of this idea of gender, always constantly comparing the two. They're just artists. That's it. They're not women artists. They're just artists, period.
I cannot think of a better way to finish this series. Thank you so much for your knowledge, for your time, for preparing all these images for us.
Yay!
It's not about female artists or male artists. It's about artists, period. The goal is to see artists for their message without any distractions, and to see art as a pocket knife, a sharp, handy, and ready for deployment tool that can slice through the veil of the present and uncover what lies beyond the edge of the current zeitgeist. We can't afford to keep silencing communities. Those muted and ignored voices are our compounded loss as humans. I hope you can see now that it is a delusion to believe that one finds itself here and under these conditions through pure merit or blame. But art is one powerful path that can take us back to sanity. Your job as a 21st century human is to get out of your comfort zone so you can see the entire painting and then remember all of the players in it so you can recalibrate your position against that reality. It is never just art. It is always a representation, and representation is key. Quasi Feminista is recorded in a plethora of rooms and offices around the world. Original music, Flor de Maria. Editing, Erika Medellin. Fact-checking and comic relief, Chatty Patty. With the support of the Ministry of Women and the Testicular Council. I'm Patricia Morales, Cip de Leon.